I got a fun little project I've been looking forward to doing for a while. I've got a whale's tooth that is really kind of a classic shape, but what's neat about it is it's really straight, doesn't have a hook to it or anything like that, and it's fairly thin. I mean, it's flat. So what I've decided to do with this is to cut it. You see this line I've got drawn up here? This is going to be my proposed cut. Then I'm going to make a belt buckle out of it. Maybe if I'm lucky, I'll make two. I've got a little sketch started on the one side here. First thing we're going to do is go down to my bandsaw and cut that in half. I've got a base scrap board here that I'll cut into to actually use as a deck because the hole around the base here is so large or enlarged by now. I like a nice tight margin around the blade. Nothing gets stuck. My plan is to retain the shape of the tooth, and I want to not distort the tooth too badly, so those came out good. I've got a sanding disc on here now that's fairly fresh, so I'll start with that. I'm gonna have to put on the vacuum. Don't want to be breathing this stuff. See, the bandsaw got it pretty close, but this sand is gonna clean it up nice. Got a little more to do on this, but I want to take a second and show you. This is kind of a rare opportunity to see the actual composition of a whale's tooth and how it has this outer white layer, which is, of course, lovely for scrimshawing on, but it's very nice for carving into too. And then it goes into this nice creamy color interior where you can see the actual growth rings of the tooth. You don't often see a whale's tooth cut open like this, so it's kind of fun to look at. This would be the anchorage, this whole cavity. They'd have a softer tissue up that held it in place. Okay, so I've got the back all sanded off. I've taken a minute and kind of finished up the sketch on this. Now, whale's teeth, they're like my favorite things to work on. Love them, love them, love them. Generally, when you think of a whale's tooth and picture on it, you think of Scrimshaw, the etching, where you're actually cutting fine lines into the ivory and then applying ink, and then your picture comes up the way you scratch. Though I like doing that, I've got a couple videos on that. This is going to actually be carved in, so it's not as common to see relief carving on whale's teeth. It does happen, and it's going to happen today. Basically, what I'm going to do is start wasting away the background. You go for the furthest points first, the sky. That goes first, try to go around everything else, and then work your way out towards the front of the scene. Major subjects here are the whale, of course, a boat full of hunters, about ready to stick a lance or a harpoon in them, and over here in the distance, you've got one that's been captured and flagged and is being towed into the ship. In the background, we'll be processing the whale oil out of the blubber, also saving bone and tooth or baleen, whatever the case may be in this particular hunting ground. I'm going to be carving this fairly deeply, mainly because I have a lot of material to play with, and the other part is that I want to get through that white outer layer and expose some of this pretty cream colored ivory behind. It's starting to come through, so I'm going to keep going in that direction. Pretty much everything but the black lines goes. To end the background right where the white starts. If it works out the way I hope, the background will be that nice creamy color, and then the ship and all the rest of it is going to be that white ivory, kind of like a cameo. It's all scratched in, and then I rub some ink into it. I won't lose my design now. Now it's time to get little chisels out. The rotary tool makes little curved ends, round ends. It can't go square, so the chisel, we're going to put in the corners. As I push this image back, things could get distorted, and if you want the outline to be as close as possible to the finish, that bay right there is all squared up and bottomed out pretty good. So now what I'm doing is going to scrape down and flatten out the sky and get this pretty tiger striping to come up. And after that, I'm going to start pushing the ship and the water back and relieving these guys, bring them forward, and it's all going to start coming together. I'm using this tool here, which is one of my go-to hand tools, just a triangular point. It's sharp quite a ways up the sides here, so you can scrape with it and things like that. But it's also great for scratching in some fine details. Okay, so now I'm going to be starting to push all that scenery back into the horizon and bringing up all this as a result. So what I want to do is push this back into the horizon as far as I can. Okay, now we've got everything roughed out up here in the foreground. The water's pretty choppy looking now, so I'm going to take my favorite little scraper here and start to planish it down. I want to get the surface smooth, and then I can put the waves in. If you go one way for a while and then the other way, you know, as you're going one way, you tend to pick up some chatters, but if you go across the other way, like cross hatchet, that will plane down those ridges of the chatter as you're scraping and carving and digging and gouging and stuff. You'll find you want to approach the ivory from so many different angles. That's why I don't usually mount it on like a vise or something to hold it. For this kind of work, carving, that's just, you're always like doot, doot, doot. Now with etching, Scrimshaw, that's handy to have locked up, stationary. I've been enjoying the figuring in this middle ivory here, the deeper stuff with you getting the curly look to it, like curly maple, just so pretty. And it's starting to show up more and more as we scrape and clean up. You'll see all this in the foreground is all in white. We scrape pretty close to those features, but you gotta break out little chisels and kind of define them better. There's a technique called walking engraving, when you take a chisel and you walk it across a surface like this and it leaves a zigzaggy pattern. But in carving, you can also do that same sort of thing, and it removes a good amount of material with very little effort. Of course, you have to go back then and carve down those little walking tracks. You zigzag. Alright, to catch y'all up, my ship might look a little different than it did a minute ago. And what had happened was that it was too far forward and I was having a really hard time getting it back the way I wanted it. So I actually ended up carving pretty much the whole thing off. There was enough of a hump in the background in the sky here that I could do the whole ship right in that. So I've redrawn it and I'm cutting it in. I'm using this tool to outline around every feature, the mast, some of the rigging, like the ladders and things like that. So I outline around with the scribe, scratching in straight line around it, and then I go at it with the chisels to take away all the waste material between those lines. Every once in a while, when you start a project or carving with one thing in mind, as you get into it, you find you have to kind of move with it. If you're too stiff, things don't come out right. So this is me moving with it. Whale's tooth is probably the nicest thing that I've carved on. The thing that makes it so nice is it's got a very tight grain and it takes detail really well. That also kind of makes it one of the hardest or densest ivories, not counting the enamel on a hippo's tooth, but I don't count that as ivory. I count it as a nuisance. See, I'm holding the chisel upside down, right, with the bevel on the upside. That way it gets the most dig into the surface with the least amount of pressure. And so without over pushing, you just kind of walk it along like this. You can see it's taking off a nice little layer. If I was trying to blacken in an area in Scrimshaw, I would use this same basic technique and then just ink it. Well, I've got the ship just about where I want it. I'm going to sand the ship and the background before I put too much detail into it. Don't want to sand away all those efforts. Yeah, that's pretty good. I like it much better. I'm going to start with a piece of 320. Roll it into a little stick. Pretty good. Now we'll still I think I can work with that. So it's time to have some fun with the whale, I think. This knife has a nice swept end, and I use it kind of a scrape or gouge. When a blade chatters, it means it leaves kind of a tut-tut-tut-tut, you know, like a washboardy kind of a surface behind. It's not usually beneficial to process, so try to avoid it. This line right here represents the back, the whale's tail. I'm going to carve down away from that on both sides. Got the tail all kind of carved out and polished up, and that's good. Now I'm going to take a break from the picture and do a little work on the outline. It's going to be the border is going to be a rope. I'm going to use this. This is a triangular burn that I made out of an old file. It's very sharp, and then the end is clipped off at just a slight angle, so it really delivers a sharp edge down at the bottom here, the point, which is the part that I'm going to be using. You plow your way along the ivory according to your mark. Slow and steady wins the race. This tool doesn't tend to wander, so it goes very nicely where you direct it. So I'm just going to elaborate on this track that I laid down, deepen it. I'll keep my tool tipped a bit so that most of the material is coming off of the left-hand side of my tool, the part that's going to be the rope. I'm going to take a little chisel and actually round this business off here. Okay, so I've gotten all the way around with this little tool. I'm going to go with a slightly larger chisel, go around the inside. This is basically making it into an octagon, or a section of an octagon. So I get around the whole thing with this, and then I'll go to one of my scrapers and take off the corners, which will result in a fairly round or rounded surface. And then I can lay out the actual rope. Okay, and there we are. I'm using my finger as a depth gauge here to kind of keep the point of this tool out of the sky region of my firing. Got it pretty well rounded off all the way around. So, start just about anywhere. Biggest thing, of course, is to maintain the same angle and the consistent distance between. So I've got the rope border done. I like it. Time to do the hunters. It was good to have done the border when I did, because it makes it nice to be able to carve like the waves right into it and not have to go back and redo it. This little round-ended scraper is a great little gouge for tighter radiuses. I got most of the carving done and polished up. Cut in some lines, which will really pop when I put the ink to it. So we got the longboats all planked in. Looks kind of good. I'm gonna start putting in some of the rigging on the tall ship. So I've got a lovely piece of brass here that's going to be the backing of this buckle. Just gonna. It's quite thick. This will take a while.